Just send us the bill. That was all my mother said when the hospital called, while I was coming out of surgery with 3 broken ribs and internal bleeding. A truck had hit me on my way home for 4th of July weekend, and I woke under fluorescent lights with a nurse asking who else she should call, because no one with my last name had shown up. Not my mother, not my brother, not one flower on the windowsill. My name is Lorraine Ashford. I'm 49, and for 7 years, my family had called me the liar, the thief, the one who walked away. So I did what I'd learned to do. I stayed quiet. I signed the discharge papers myself. Then the nurse set a wrapped box on my tray and lowered her voice. The man who paid your bill said to open it in front of them. That was when I realized somebody outside that room knew exactly what my family had done. I want to tell you about that box. But to understand why it mattered, why a stranger settling my bill could frighten my family more than the truck that nearly killed me, you have to know what they spent 7 years burying. So let me start where the nurse left me. Alone, under those lights, with a box I was afraid to touch. The hospital sat off the same Rogue Valley highway where the Ashford Dunmore lumberyard had fed half the town for 40 years, which meant every nurse on that floor already knew exactly whose daughter wasn't getting any visitors. I could tell by the way they looked at the empty chair beside my bed, then at me, then somewhere else. There was a brace strapped around my ribs that made every breath feel like a decision. A line ran into the back of my hand, taped down with something that pulled at the skin when I moved. On my wrist, a plastic band with my name printed too small. I lay still and counted the ceiling tiles because counting was something I could finish. A nurse came in with a clipboard held against her chest. She had kind eyes and tired shoes. She asked if there was someone else she should try. Someone who could come sit with me, drive me home, anything. Is there anyone we can call, honey? I thought about the names. I thought about how each of them would answer a phone with my number on it. There's no one, I said. She didn't argue. She just reached over and straightened my pillow. A small thing. The kind of thing nobody had done for me in a long time. And on her way out, she said, almost under her breath, "You're not as alone as they made it look." I didn't know what she meant yet. I only knew that no one was coming. I'd stopped expecting otherwise a long time ago. The next morning, a different nurse came to go over the paperwork, and she hesitated at the part where the responsible party was listed, the way people hesitate before they hand you something sharp. She told me the hospital had reached my mother the night of the surgery. She told me what my mother had said. Not, "How is she?" Not which room. Not, "I'm on my way." 4 words. "Your mother said to send the bill." I kept my eyes on the window. Outside, somebody's family was carrying balloons toward the parking lot. I felt the brace move with my breathing, and nothing else move at all. The strange part came when the nurse turned the page. The balance owed, the number that should have had a comma and a story behind it, read 0. Paid in full. I asked if there'd been a mistake. There hadn't. I lay there 2 more days trying to make that number make sense. Someone had paid for the surgery, the imaging, the room, the blood I'd been given in the night. Thousands of dollars, handed over with no name attached, for a woman whose own mother had told them to mail the invoice. I went through the list of people it could have been. There wasn't a list. 7 years of keeping to myself had left me with co-workers who knew my first name and a landlord who knew my rent was always early. No one who would cover a hospital bill and walk away. Certainly no one who would do it and ask for nothing. So I told myself it was a billing error that would unwind on its own, that some office would call in a month and the real number would arrive. I was good at telling myself things. I'd had practice. They discharged me 2 days later. I was sitting on the edge of the bed in clothes that smelled like the inside of a plastic bag, working out how I'd get home with 3 broken ribs and no one to drive, when the discharge nurse came in carrying a box. It was wrapped. Actually wrapped, in brown paper, with my name written across the top in ink. Not printed on a label. Written. By a hand that pressed hard on the downstrokes and looped the L the same way it had looped on birthday cards when I was a girl. The nurse set it on the tray table and lowered her voice like she was passing me something she wasn't sure she should. "A man came to the desk yesterday," she said. "Paid your whole bill. Left this. He said to tell you to open it in front of them." "In front of who?" I asked. "He didn't say. Just in front of them. You'd know." I looked at my name in that ink, and my mouth went dry. I knew that handwriting. I had spent 49 years knowing that handwriting. But the man whose hand made those letters had been dead since April. My grandfather kept a pair of reading glasses on a chain around his neck, and when he wanted you to really look at something with him, he'd lift them off and hand them to you, like he was lending you his eyes for a minute. His name was Augustus Ashford. He and a man named Walter Dunmore had started Ashford Dunmore back when the valley still ran on timber. 2 men and a flatbed and a handshake. And by the time I was old enough to work there, it had become buildings and storefronts and land with their name on the deeds. I started in the office in my 20s, learning the accounts by living in them. My father, Edmund, ran the operations side until his heart gave out the spring I turned 37, and after that the shape of the family changed. My mother, Diane, and my older brother, Spencer, moved into the spaces my father left, and my grandfather, who was getting older, let them. I stayed in the accounts. And on the slow afternoons, my grandfather would call me into his office, and we'd sit with the ledgers and a pot of tea going cold between us, and he would talk. "You know," he said once, lifting those glasses off and folding them into my hand, "you're the only one who asks how I am. Everybody else asks how it's doing." He tipped his head at the window, at all of it, the yards and the lots. "You ask about me." I told him that was because the rest of them couldn't tell us apart, him and the company. He laughed at that, and then he got quiet, and he tapped the ledger and said something I didn't understand for a long time. "The real value was never the cash, Lorraine. People forget that. The cash is the smallest part." I thought he was being sentimental. He wasn't. Near the end of those afternoons, my grandfather started asking me for something else. He'd lower his voice, even though it was only the 2 of us, and ask me to look things over for him. "The real numbers," he said. Not the tidy summaries Spencer brought him in folders, the actual books. He'd hold my wrist a moment and tell me the figures didn't sing the way they used to, and that he trusted my eyes more than his own now. I thought he was just an old man who wanted his granddaughter close. I said yes because I loved him, and because being trusted by him was the one place in that family where I felt like I was worth something. I didn't understand that being his eyes was the most dangerous thing I could be. That the moment my grandfather started handing me the truth, I became the one person who had to be removed. The first thing that didn't add up was a vendor. I was reconciling the building supply accounts, the kind of work that puts you to sleep until it doesn't, and a name surfaced that I couldn't place. Cascade Ridge Supply. There were invoices going to it, real money, and when I went looking for what Cascade Ridge had ever delivered, I found paper and no lumber, no deliveries, no yard tickets, just numbers moving out. I pulled the approvals because every payment that size needed a signature, and there it was. My grandfather's signature, looping the way his hand looped, on a payment authorization dated a Tuesday in March. I remembered that Tuesday. My grandfather had spent it in a hospital bed in Medford with a line in his arm and a monitor counting his heart. He had not signed anything that day. He could barely lift a cup. I took the invoice down the hall to my brother. Spencer was at his desk, and when I set the page in front of him and asked him about Cascade Ridge, something passed over his face and was gone, smooth as water closing. "It's a pass-through account," he said, not looking up. "Don't make this complicated, Lorraine. It's bookkeeping." I asked him to explain the signature on a day our grandfather was in the hospital. He finally looked up and he smiled, and the smile was the part that scared me. "You've been working too hard," he said. "You're seeing things." But I couldn't leave it. That night, I went back through 3 years of the building supply accounts, line by line, and Cascade Ridge wasn't alone. There were other names like it, vendors that took money and delivered nothing, and the same looping signature turned up on payment after payment. Some on days I could prove my grandfather had been nowhere near the office. It wasn't a stray error. It was a current, running steadily out of the company and into somewhere I couldn't see, and it had been running for years. I made copies. I told myself I was only being careful. I put them in a folder at the bottom of a drawer at home, and for a few weeks I did nothing, because doing something meant admitting what I already knew. His signature, on a day he'd been in a hospital bed. I left the original on Spencer's desk, and I couldn't stop seeing it. The dinners changed after that. We still had them, the whole family at my mother's long table, and on the surface nothing was different. But underneath, a story was being built, and I was the one being built into it. It started small. My mother would refill everyone's glass and pause at mine. "You've always had such an imagination, sweetheart," she'd say. "Warm as anything, to no question I'd asked." Or she'd lean toward an aunt and murmur, just loud enough, that I'd been under so much strain lately that they should go easy on me. Spencer would mention, casually, that I'd gotten confused about some paperwork. A cousin started watching me the way you watch someone you've been told is fragile. I'd walk into a room and feel a sentence stop, and I'd see the look settle on me, soft and pitying and certain, before I had done a single thing. My Aunt Carol, who used to slip me the good caramels under the table when I was small, started touching my arm whenever she spoke to me now, slow and careful. "You just rest, honey," she said to me one night, though I hadn't said I was tired. I understood then that whatever they were telling people, it was working. That was the part I couldn't fight, because there was nothing to fight yet. They were writing the story before I'd done anything. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself families talk, that my mother's cruelty had always come dressed as concern, that this was no different. I thought, if it ever came to it, the worst they'd do was doubt me. I had no idea how much worse it could get. 2 weeks later, Spencer set a document in front of me and held out a pen. It was a year-end certification, the kind of thing the company's accountant signs to say the books are true and complete. My name was on the signature line. Spencer stood over my desk with that patient, reasonable face, and he told me it was a formality, that everyone had already signed, that they just needed mine to close the year. I'd read those books. I knew what closing the year on them meant. I set the pen down on the desk, without touching the line. "I'm not signing this," I said, "and I'm going to talk to Grandpa. He has a right to know what's been moving through his company." Something shifted in the room. My mother was in the doorway. She'd been in the doorway the whole time, and she came in and put her hand over mine on the desk, warm and heavy. "Lorraine," she said, gentle as a hymn, "be careful. People already wonder about you. Don't give them a reason to wonder more." Spencer picked the pen back up and set it down again, closer to my hand, the way you nudge a door. "Think about what you're doing," he said. "You've got a good name in this town. It's a shame how fast a good name can go." He wasn't loud. He never was. That was the part that landed. I understand now it wasn't a warning. It was a schedule. I thought that refusing was the brave part. I thought the hard thing was saying no. I didn't understand that I'd just told them exactly how dangerous I was, and handed them the timeline they needed. It moved fast after that, faster than grief. Within a month there was a story, and the story was that money had gone missing, and that I had taken it. There was paper to back it, paper I'd never seen. With my name in places my name had no business being. There were quiet conversations I wasn't in. By the time it reached the rest of the family, it wasn't a question anymore. It was a fact they'd already decided to forgive me for, which is the cruelest kind of fact, because you can't argue with mercy. I tried once. I cornered an uncle at a family lunch and started to explain about Cascade Ridge, about the signatures, and he just looked at me with that soft, settled pity and said, "We know what you did, Lorraine. We just want you to get help." I stopped after that. There's no winning against people who've decided your defense is a symptom. The end came in a conference room with the blinds half drawn. My mother and Spencer and a lawyer I'd never met sat on one side of the table, and across from me they laid out a folder, my name on the tab, and inside it the paper that said, I was a thief. Transfers I'd never made. Accounts I'd never opened. My grandfather's signature again, where it shouldn't have been. They didn't call the police. They told me kindly that for the family's sake, they'd keep it quiet if I left quietly. My mother dabbed at her eyes while Spencer slid the folder an inch closer. I remember thinking the tears looked rehearsed. I remember being too stunned to say so. I signed the separation papers because the alternative was a fight I had no proof to win, and I walked out of the only place I'd ever felt useful, carrying a cardboard box and a name that no longer belonged to me. And here's the part I have never told anyone. I didn't stop trying to reach my grandfather. I wrote to him. Letters, real ones, in my own hand, every few weeks at first, then every month. Cards on his birthday. I never got an answer. A few came back unopened, and the rest just vanished into the silence. And I told myself an old man was too tired, too far away, that maybe he'd heard the story too. By that spring, I was the family's cautionary tale. The daughter who'd stolen. The one who walked away. The last time I drove out to his house, my mother met me on the porch. She didn't let me pass the door. She stood in the gap of it with the light behind her, and she said the only thing that could have turned me around. He doesn't want to see you, Lorraine. Please don't make this harder. I looked past her shoulder, into the house, for any sign of him. There wasn't one. From somewhere inside drifted the smell of his pipe tobacco, sweet and familiar, close enough to reach. He was right there. So I went back to my car. Behind me, I heard the deadbolt turn. One sound, final, in the quiet. The lock clicked like a verdict. 7 years went by. I built a small life out of early rent and first names, and I made my peace with being no one's, and I never once imagined I'd hear from him again. Then, in a hospital room, 7 years later, his handwriting found me. The box sat on my kitchen table for a full day before I could open it. When I finally cut the paper, 2 things sat on top. An envelope, thick, with my name on it in my grandfather's hand, and under it, a business card, cream-colored, soft at the corners from being carried, Walter Dunmore. I knew the name the way you know the name of a mountain you grew up under. My grandfather's partner, the other half of the handshake. On the back of the card, in a different hand, 3 words. Call me first. I turned my grandfather's envelope over in my fingers, and I couldn't make myself open it. So I called the number instead. Walter Dunmore came to my apartment that evening. He was 77, slow getting out of the car, and he held his hat in both hands at my door like a man at a graveside. I'd seen him maybe twice in my life, but he looked at me like he'd been waiting a long time. I'm the one who paid your bill, he said when I asked. I came to the desk myself. Your grandfather made me promise, years ago, that if that family ever left you stranded, I'd be the one to step in. He turned the hat in his hands. He knew they'd leave you, Lorraine. I'm sorry to say he was right. I told him I didn't understand. I told him my grandfather had cut me off, that he'd believed I was a thief, that he'd died thinking it. Walter Dunmore shook his head slowly. No, he said, he didn't. And I'm not the one who should tell you why. I'm just the executor. I don't take $1 of this. I want you to know that. I'm the trustee. Nothing more. He was quiet a moment, looking at the floor. Augustus and I built that company with our hands, he said. 60 years I knew him. At the end, when he couldn't get out much, I'd sit with him on Sundays. He talked about you almost every time. He'd ask if I thought you were all right, out there on your own. Walter Dunmore's voice caught, just slightly, and he pressed his lips together until it passed. He never believed it, not for one day at the end. I need you to hear that from someone who was in the room. He nodded at the envelope still in my hand. He wrote it all down. He said the letter would explain the rest. So that night, alone, I read my grandfather's letter. His handwriting had gotten shakier near the end, the loops looser, the lines drifting up off level, and I could see him bent over the page, taking his time, the way he took his time with everything that mattered. He wrote that he was sorry. He wrote that it had taken him too long to see what was happening in his own house, that by the time he understood, They had already built the walls too high for him to climb. He wrote that he knew now I had never taken a cent, that the paper they showed him had been made, that the silence between us had been manufactured, letter by letter, lie by lie. And then he wrote the line that broke something loose in me, the line I have read so many times since that I no longer need the page. I always knew which of you told the truth. I let them talk me out of it for a while. I will not forgive myself for that. But I never once stopped knowing. I had to set the letter down. I sat at my kitchen table with my hand flat on the wood, and I did not move for a long time, and the only sound in the room was the refrigerator, and somewhere under it, my own breathing, which would not come even. When I could, I picked it up again. He had written about a trust. He had written that he'd put something aside for me, quietly, where they couldn't reach it, and that it was not an apology, because an apology was just words. What I left you is not an apology. It is a correction. Open it in front of them, Lorraine. Make them watch. He believed me. After everything, after 7 years of their version of me, he had believed me all along. Underneath the letter, at the bottom of the box, there was a folder. Inside it were the trust documents, dense pages with my name typed where I least expected to find it, and a summary on top with a number I had to read twice. A little over $1.3 million, set aside in a trust, in my name, signed and sealed more than a year before he died. 14 months, the date said. He'd built it while they still had him believing I was gone for good. I sat there holding more money than I'd ever touched, and I called Walter Dunmore back because I didn't understand why a man who'd been told I was a thief would leave me anything, let alone this. There was a pause on the line. Then he said gently, "Lorraine, that's the smallest part." I asked him what that meant. "There's a second envelope in that folder," he said, "sealed. He wanted you to open that one with me in the room, not before." I found it then, tucked behind the documents, my name across it again, and below it, in his hand, "Open with Walter." The smallest part, he had said. $1.3 million was the smallest part. I'd spent 7 years believing I'd been thrown away for being worthless. I was beginning to understand I'd been thrown away for being chosen. Walter Dunmore came back 2 days later, and this time he brought a slim accordion file, soft and worn, that he set on my table like it was heavier than it looked. I asked him the question I'd been carrying for 7 years. Why? Why me? Why, of all of them, was I the one they'd thrown out, when I was the only one who'd never taken anything? He didn't soften it. "Because you found it," he said. "That's all it ever was. You weren't difficult, Lorraine. You were inconvenient." He tapped the file. "Your grandfather had started trusting you with the real books. You'd started asking the right questions. If you'd stayed, you'd have found all of it, and you'd have told him, and he'd have believed you. They couldn't have that. So before he could put his trust where he wanted it, they made sure no one would ever trust your word again." I sat with that. 7 years of believing I'd been pushed out because something was wrong with me. 7 years of carrying a shame that, it turned out, had been issued to me on purpose, like a uniform. I asked why my grandfather hadn't just fixed it himself then. Why he hadn't called the family out, restored me, set it all right while he still could. Walter's jaw tightened. "Because by then he couldn't," he said. "They ran his house, his phone, his mail, who came through the door, his medicine, all of it. He was a proud man trapped inside his own life. He knew that if he moved against them in the open, they'd have him declared confused inside a month and take over everything, including whatever he tried to leave you. So he did the only thing he had left. He went around them, quietly. He built you a door they couldn't lock." He looked at me. It cost him, doing it in secret, knowing he might not live to see you walk through it. But he did it anyway. We opened the accordion file together, and the years came back in paper. Walter had kept things. Old statements, board minutes, copies of approvals. The quiet accumulation of a man who'd sensed something was rotting before he could name it. And there, 3 pages in, was a name I knew in my body, before I knew it in my head. Cascade Ridge Supply. I flagged that name 7 years ago, I said. My voice came out flat. I took it to Spencer. He told me I was seeing things. And someone made sure you never got to ask twice, Walter said. He laid another page beside it, a payment to Cascade Ridge dated long after I was gone, and another after that. It didn't stop when you left. It got bigger. They just didn't have anyone left in that office who'd recognize what they were looking at. I asked Walter how much. He shook his head and said it was bigger than I'd want to hear standing up. So I sat down, and he told me, and he was right. The vendor I'd flagged, the one that had cost me everything, was still there, still bleeding money out of my grandfather's company years after they'd called me a liar for noticing it. I learned fast that a folder of suspicions isn't proof, and that the difference between the two is people with credentials. Walter brought in a forensic accountant named Dale Forsyth, a square, unhurried man who spoke about money the way a surgeon talks about a body. No drama, just structure. He spread the records across my table and traced the routes with one finger, payment to shell vendor to nowhere, and when I asked him how confident he was, he didn't blink. "Paper doesn't lie," he said. "People do. We follow the paper." We brought in a document examiner for the signatures, and an estate attorney named Catherine Holloway, the same lawyer who had quietly drafted my grandfather's trust the year before he died, and who had made him sit for a doctor's evaluation the very same week, because she'd known even then what was coming. The four of us started building something, not a story, a case. We met at Catherine Holloway's office on a Thursday, the table covered end to end. Dale Forsyth laid out the money in columns. Catherine laid out the law. The trust my grandfather left me was solid, she said, drafted clean, backed by the doctor's letter from the same week, harder to break than anyone sane would try. But the trust was only the beginning. The real weight sat in those columns, in what the money proved, that the people who had called me a thief had been emptying the company for years. "Build it slow," Catherine said, sliding a legal pad to the center of the table. "Document everything. The names, the dates, the signatures. When we're ready, we won't accuse anyone. We'll just show them." I wrote my own notes in the margins, the way my grandfather had taught me to read a ledger, and for the first time in 7 years, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I felt like I was laying a floor, and somewhere across town they felt it. I knew because my phone rang, and it was a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, voice bright and brittle, just checking in, just wondering how I was. And then, near the end, almost an afterthought, "We heard you've been keeping busy lately." I hung up and sat very still. They'd heard. Of course they'd heard. For 7 years I had spent all my strength defending myself to people who'd already made up their minds. I was done with that. I stopped defending myself, and I started building. Here's where I want to ask you something. If you'd just learned that the people who raised you had spent years constructing a lie to bury you, and you finally held the one thing that could prove every word of it, what would you do next? Would you call them? Walk away with what was yours and never look back? Or would you do what I did and go quiet and gather every receipt, knowing they would come for you the moment they understood what you had? Sit with that for a second, then stay with me, because they came faster than I was ready for. There was a man named Nathan Briggs who I almost didn't find. He'd been the company's accountant before me, in the years just after my father died. A careful man who'd left under a cloud nobody could quite explain. Dale Forsyth tracked him to a small house 2 towns over, and when I knocked, he looked at me through the screen door for a long moment, and then he looked past me, like he was checking whether anyone had followed. We sat at his kitchen table. He poured coffee neither of us drank, and when I told him why I'd come, his shoulders dropped an inch, the way a man's shoulders drop when he's been holding something up alone for a long time. "I figured," he said, "someday someone honest would come asking." He got up and came back with a cardboard box, taped shut, soft with age, and set it between us. I made copies before they walked me out. Told myself I was crazy to keep them. Kept them anyway. Inside were years of records, the originals of things that had been quietly rewritten since. He turned a page toward me with one finger. "They did to you what they did to me," he said. "Only worse. With me, they just made me leave. With you, they made everyone believe you were the reason." He told me how it had gone for him. He'd found a single vendor that didn't add up, and he'd taken it to Spencer, and within a month there were whispers that his books were sloppy, that he'd been drinking, that he couldn't be trusted with the numbers anymore. None of it was true. By the time they walked him out, he'd half believed the version of himself they'd built. "That's the part that stays with you," he said, turning his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. Not that they lied. That for a while, you start to wonder if maybe they're right. I knew exactly what he meant. I'd been wearing that same doubt for 7 years. I sat there holding a stranger's proof that I wasn't crazy, and that I never had been. With Nathan Briggs's box, the picture stopped being a suspicion and became a shape. Dale Forsythe worked for 3 weeks and laid it out on Catherine Holloway's conference table like a map. Shell vendors, Cascade Ridge, and 4 others, just like it. Money moving out in steady amounts, year after year. More than 20 payment authorizations carrying my grandfather's signature. On days the man had been in a hospital, on a plane, once on the day of a funeral. And underneath all of it, a total that had grown in the dark, a little over $8.2 million. Gone. "This isn't a mistake," Dale said, tapping the columns. "A mistake happens once. This is a method. It repeats. It hides. It learns." He slid one page out of the stack and set it in front of me by itself. A payment authorization for $60-some thousand to a vendor that had never existed, signed in my grandfather's looping hand, dated the day we buried my father. I remembered that day. I remembered my grandfather's hands shaking too hard to hold the order of service, my mother holding it for him. He had not signed a thing that afternoon. Someone had sat at a desk and practiced being him while the rest of us stood at a grave. I set the page back down and looked out the window for a while before I could speak. We brought in Francis Whitmore, the trust officer from the bank, the one who'd sat across from my grandfather when he set up the trust. I needed to know the trust would hold, that they couldn't simply wave it away. Francis didn't hesitate. "I was in the room," she said. "He read every page. He asked sharper questions than half the men I deal with at 40. He knew exactly what he was doing. I'd stake my license on it." I looked at the spread of paper, at 20 forged signatures and $8 million missing dollars, and a method that had run for the better part of a decade. When it was time to open the second envelope, Walter Dunmore came to sit with me, because my grandfather had asked him to. We put it on the kitchen table where the first box had been. My name across the front in that failing hand, and underneath it, "Open with Walter." I ran my thumb along the seal and didn't break it. "He made me wait too," Walter said quietly. "Wouldn't tell me what was in it until it was done. Said you'd need a witness who'd loved him, not a lawyer who'd bill him." He almost smiled. "Whatever's in there, Lorraine, he wanted you sitting down. So sit down." For a moment neither of us moved. The kitchen was quiet, the refrigerator and nothing else. I thought about how my grandfather had planned this, every step of it, knowing he would be gone long before I ever reached this table. He had choreographed a conversation he would never get to have. My hands weren't steady on the envelope. I sat. I thought I understood what I was holding. A little over $1 million in a trust had already rearranged my whole understanding of who my grandfather had been to me at the end. I thought the second envelope would be more of the same. A letter, maybe. A few more accounts. "Whatever this is," I said, "they're afraid of it." He said open it in front of them. "Then it's the part they're terrified of," Walter said. I broke the seal. Inside the second envelope were share certificates. Not a letter. Not a list of accounts. Stock. My grandfather's stock. Signed over into the trust with my name on it. And clipped behind it, a schedule of deeds. 18 properties. Storefronts and lots and buildings along the streets I'd grown up on. Walter Dunmore read my face and answered the question I couldn't form. 62%, he said, of the whole company. He moved his controlling share into your trust, and the real estate with it. All told, the appraisal came back at $54 million. I didn't move. The number was too big to feel. It just sat in the room with us. It means you don't just inherit money, Lorraine, Walter said. It means you control the company, which means you can open every book they ever forged. You can call the audit they've spent a decade making sure no one could call. I asked him what that meant in plain terms. He said it plainly. I could walk into that company as its largest owner. I could order the books opened. Every shell vendor, every forged page, every dollar they'd moved into the dark. All of it would have to come into the light, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The locked room had a key now. He'd left the key to me. For 7 years they had told a town I was nothing. The thing they buried me to keep was mine. Their worry started arriving by mail. The first letter came on heavy paper from a law firm I didn't recognize, full of soft and dangerous words about the family's interests and concerns about the administration of the estate. It didn't accuse me of anything. It just wanted me to know they were watching and that they had lawyers, the way you let someone know a dog is in the yard. Then my mother called. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, her voice was exactly as I remembered it, warm and full of a love that had always come with a price tag. "Lorraine, sweetheart," she said, "we're worried about you. We've heard you've gotten yourself wrapped up in all of this. And honey, it isn't healthy. This obsession. You've been through so much. Let us help you before it gets out of hand." I sat there with the phone against my ear and listened to her perform a mother. She asked if I was eating. She asked if I'd been sleeping. She mentioned, lightly, that grief makes people imagine things, that no one would blame me, that it wasn't too late to come home and let the family take care of everything. I understood, listening to her, that she didn't yet know exactly what I had. If she had, she wouldn't have wasted the tenderness. I told her I was fine and I hung up, and my hands were steady, and that surprised me. After that, the small things started. A second letter, sharper than the first, demanding an accounting of every conversation I'd had about the estate. A man I didn't know, parked across from my building one afternoon, gone the next time I looked. My landlord mentioned, puzzled, that someone had called the office asking what hours I kept. None of it was ever quite enough to point at. All of it was meant to be felt. They couldn't yet see what I was holding, so they were trying to make the holding cost me something, to remind me they had money and lawyers and patience, and that I was still, in their minds, one woman alone in a small apartment. A week later, Walter Dunmore called me before 8 in the morning, and I knew from the first word that they'd moved. They filed, he said. They had gone to court to break the trust, and to break it, they had to attack the one thing they couldn't buy or frighten. They had to attack my grandfather himself. The petition claimed he hadn't been of sound mind when he signed it, that he'd been confused, declining, vulnerable, that someone, and they meant Walter, had taken advantage of a failing old man. I read the filing twice. The same people who had isolated him, who had run his house and screened his mail and stood between him and his own granddaughter, were now telling a judge he'd been too far gone to know his own wishes. I called Catherine Holloway. She'd been expecting it. "It's the only move they have," she said. "They can't argue the documents, so they'll argue the man. They'll bring in the version of him they built, the confused old soul who didn't know what he was signing, and they'll dress it up as concern." She paused. "It's cynical. In a room that never knew him, it might even work, which is exactly why we don't argue with them. We let him speak for himself." I didn't know yet what she meant by that. I would. To keep what he'd left me, I would have to prove a dead man's mind. There was a hearing date at the bottom of the page. They'd set a clock, so I started running. 3 days before the hearing, Catherine Holloway called and asked me to come to her office and told me to sit down before she showed me what they'd found. On her desk was a banker's box from my grandfather's house, one of several Walter had been allowed to collect after the funeral. Inside, under old tax folders, was a bundle held together with a rubber band gone brittle with age. Catherine slid it across the desk to me without a word. It was my handwriting, my letters, the ones I'd written him over 7 years, the ones that came back unopened, the ones that vanished into silence. Here they were, everyone, kept, not returned by him, intercepted before they ever reached him, and held, like trophies, in a box in a house I wasn't allowed to enter. I went through them with my hands and not my head. Birthday cards, 3 Christmases, a letter I'd written the week I finally stopped writing. The seal on everyone was unbroken. I found the last one I'd ever sent. I remembered writing it. I'd told him I didn't understand what had come between us, that I missed sitting in his office with the tea going cold, that whatever he'd been told, I loved him and always would, and that if he ever wanted to see me, he only had to ask. I'd sealed it and mailed it and waited, and when no answer came, I decided the silence was its own answer. It had never been his silence. It had been a rubber band and a box, and 2 people deciding what an old man was allowed to know. I didn't say anything for a while. I just kept turning them over, looking for one that had been opened, and there wasn't one. He never saw them, I finally said. It wasn't a question. No, Catherine said gently. He didn't. They made sure of it. As far as your grandfather knew, you wrote once, the year you left, and never again. They told him you'd taken the money and washed your hands of all of us, including him. He only learned the truth in his last year or so, when Walter got him alone long enough to hear it. For 7 years I had believed an old man had turned his back on me. The whole time, a rubber band and a box had been standing between us, but he had learned the truth, and before he died, he had left proof that he knew exactly what he was doing. Catherine set a small recorder on the desk, the kind you can hold in one hand, and told me my grandfather had made this the same week he signed the trust, with her and a doctor present, because he'd known they would one day say his mind was gone. She pressed the button, and the room filled with his voice. It was thinner than I remembered, and slower, but it was his, every gravel of it, and the sound of it reached into my chest and closed a hand there. My name is Augustus Ashford. Today's date is the 9th of February, and I am of perfectly sound mind, whatever anyone tells you later. I know what I own. I know what I'm signing. And I know what my family has done to my granddaughter Lorraine, because I let it happen too long, and I am putting it right while I still can. He paused on the recording. I could hear him breathing, gathering himself, the way he used to gather himself before he said the thing that mattered. Lorraine, if you are hearing this, then they tried to take it from her, exactly the way I knew they would. I am asking you now, from wherever I am, do not let them. You were never the liar. You were the only one who ever told me the truth. Don't let them take it from you. Don't let them. The recording clicked off. The office was very quiet. Walter Dunmore was standing by the window, and he didn't turn around. He made me promise, he said, that if it ever came to this, I'd make sure you heard his own voice say it. Not a lawyer's words. His. Don't let them, he had said. I wouldn't. That afternoon, sitting in Catherine Holloway's office with my letters in one hand, something finally came clear that I'd spent 7 years failing to understand. I'd always believed the cruelty had been aimed at me, that I'd done something, been something, that earned it. Catherine took that apart in a single sentence. Lorraine, she said, they didn't just lie to you. They trained everyone around you to. Your mother, your brother, they spent years building a version of you and handing it to every person you loved. One conversation at a time. The aunt who pitied you, the cousins who pulled away. None of that was an accident. It was the plan. You weren't fighting your family's anger. You were fighting a story they wrote before you ever opened your mouth. I sat with that, and the strange thing was how light it made me, to finally understand that the thing I'd carried had never been a reflection of me at all. It had been a construction, a set built around a girl who asked one inconvenient question. I thought of a cousin who used to call me every birthday and how those calls had simply stopped one year. No falling out, no words, just a door closing quietly that I'd never been allowed to see anyone's hand on. Now I could see the hand. "So how do I fight a story?" I asked. Catherine almost smiled. "You don't," she said. "Stories argue back. Paper doesn't. We're not going to stand up in that hearing and tell them a better story about you. We're going to put the documents on the table and let them try to explain the signatures. Then I'll let the paper talk." I thought about all the years I'd spent explaining myself to people who'd already decided. I was finished with that. I wouldn't defend myself. I'd convict them. The night before the hearing, I laid everything out on my kitchen table one last time. The trust, the forged authorizations, Nathan Briggs's box, Dale Forsyth's columns, my letters, still in their brittle rubber band. And on top of it all, my grandfather's first letter to me, the one I no longer needed the page to read. Walter Dunmore called to check on me. He didn't ask if I was nervous. He just said one thing, in that steady voice. "Tomorrow," he said, "you let him speak. You've carried this far enough alone. Tomorrow, he carries it with you." After we hung up, I sat for a long time with the box my grandfather had sent me, the one a nurse had set on a hospital tray a lifetime ago. "Open it in front of them," he'd written. "Make them watch." I checked the lock on my own door before I went to bed, the way I always did now. But for the first time in 7 years, I wasn't locking the world out. I was getting ready to open a door I'd been told to stay behind. Tomorrow, I'd open it in front of them. In the morning, the room was full. The hearing room had pale wood walls and rows of chairs, and my family had filled the front of it like mourners at a service they'd planned themselves. My mother sat in the first row in dark blue, a tissue already folded in her hand. Spencer beside her in a suit, jaw set, the picture of a grieving son shouldering a burden. Aunts and a cousin or two behind them, a few faces from the company. Walter Dunmore sat on my side, which was the emptier side, and Catherine Holloway sat beside me with her folders squared on the table. Their lawyer went first, and he was good. He spoke about a beloved patriarch in his final years, frail, isolated, his judgment slipping. He spoke about a granddaughter who had been estranged for cause, who had reappeared at the end and gotten close to a vulnerable man and a controlling trust officer, and walked away with a fortune that should have gone to the family who cared for him. She isolated a vulnerable old man, he said, and rewrote his wishes. He held up the old folder, the one from 7 years ago, my name on the tab, and called me by the name they'd given me. The thief. He told the judge I'd stolen from the company once already, and been quietly let go to spare the family shame, and that I'd come back at the end to finish the job. He made it sound like a pattern. He made me sound like a woman who preyed on dying men. He had paper to suggest it, the same manufactured paper that had run me out of that office years before. And in that room, on that morning, it looked real. My mother dabbed at her eyes, right on the line, the way she always had. When the judge looked her way, she let her chin tremble and said softly that they only wanted to honor what Daddy had really wanted, before all this confusion. I watched the room lean toward her. I watched the judge's face soften by a degree. They'd rehearsed grief like a hymn, and they sang it well. Then Catherine Holloway stood up, and she didn't tell a story. She put the trust on the table. She called Francis Whitmore. Francis took the stand. She was steady. "I was in the room when he signed," she said. "He read every page. He asked harder questions than men half his age. He was lucid, certain. I'd stake my license on it. Their lawyer pushed. He suggested confusion. He suggested influence. Francis didn't move. He was not confused," she said. "He knew exactly what he was doing." Catherine called the document examiner next. He laid the forged authorizations on an easel where the room could see. He set my grandfather's true signature beside them. "This signature is traced," he said, and touched one. "So is this one, and this." He turned to the room. More than 20 documents, each one a small forgery, each one money leaving the company. Their lawyer rose to object and sat back down. Then Dale Forsyth walked the judge through the money. Shell vendors, Cascade Ridge, and 4 more. Over $8 million, gone in steady patient amounts. Nathan Briggs took the stand and said quietly that he'd watched it begin years ago and been thrown out for noticing. Then Catherine did one more thing. She set a bundle of letters on the table. My letters, the ones I'd written him, kept unopened in a box in his house. She held up the brittle rubber band. She asked the room to consider who had stood between a man and his own mail. She named the isolation for what it was. Not love. Containment. The lawyer for the family had no question for that. There was no question to ask. The bundle sat in plain view, every seal unbroken, and it said more than I ever could. One by one, their story lost its legs. Then it was my turn. I stood up with the box. I carried it to the front and set it on the table where everyone could see. Brown paper. My name in his hand. My grandfather sent me this, I said, from a hospital, after he was gone. He told me to open it in front of you. The room went still. I opened it. I'd set his recording inside, the one Catherine had kept all this time, and I took it out and pressed the button. His voice filled the room. My name is Augustus Ashford, and I am of perfectly sound mind, whatever anyone tells you later. I know what I own. I know what I'm signing. My mother's tissue stopped moving. Lorraine, if you are hearing this, then they tried to take it from her, exactly the way I knew they would. Do not let them. Nobody breathed. I turned and faced her. You taught me I was worthless, Diane, I said. He spent his last breath proving you a liar. I had never called her by her name before. Not once in my life. It landed like a slap. She looked at me like she'd never seen me before. For once, she had nothing to say. Spencer came up out of his chair. That money was supposed to be... He stopped himself. Too late. The whole room had heard where that sentence was going. The room finally heard a dead man tell the truth. After that, it was paper and procedure, and it didn't take long. The judge ruled from the bench. The trust was valid. My grandfather had been of sound mind. The documentation was overwhelming, and the petition to void it was denied. The forged signatures and the missing millions were referred to the district attorney's office for criminal review. Control of the company, the controlling share my grandfather had signed into my trust, was confirmed as mine. The first thing I did with that control, within the week, was order the audit my grandfather had never been allowed to call. Every book, every vendor, every year. The locked room was open now, and I was the one holding the door. The referral to the district attorney meant Spencer and my mother would answer for the signatures in a different kind of room, one I wouldn't have to sit in. That part, at last, was no longer mine to carry. My mother didn't dab her eyes on the way out. There was nothing to perform anymore. Spencer wouldn't look at me. His lawyer was already talking fast and low in his ear. The aunts and the cousin filed out quickly, the way people leave a room when the story they came to support turns out to be the wrong one. For 7 years they had written who I was, and a town had believed it. The story they wrote about me was over. It was his voice that freed me, not mine. A few weeks later there was a knock on my door, and when I opened it, my mother was standing on my step. She had aged. Or maybe I was finally seeing her clearly. No tissue this time. She stood where the light fell across the boards and said my name the way she used to. Soft. Reaching. Like the last 7 years had been a misunderstanding we could fold up and put away. We're still family, Lorraine, she said. Whatever's happened, we can find a way back from this. I thought about the box on a hospital tray. I thought about a bundle of letters under a rubber band. I thought about a nurse asking who she should call. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. You sent the bill, I said. I kept the receipt. She started to speak, and I stepped back, and I closed the door. Gently. All the way. 7 years ago, I'd stood on the wrong side of a door while a lock turned me away. This time I turned the lock. If someone ever built a version of you and handed it to everyone you loved, if you've ever had to live under a story you didn't write, I'd like to hear yours. Leave it in the comments below. And if this reached something in you, subscribe and stay a while, because there are more of these to come. But before you go, there's one more thing I need to tell you. It's the part I kept for myself. On my porch that evening, I sat with his first letter in my lap and his reading glasses folded in my hand. I'd read that letter 100 times. But there was one line at the bottom I had never been able to say out loud. The line he'd left me last, after everything else, in that failing hand that pressed hard on the downstrokes. You always asked how I was, Lorraine, not how it was doing. You. So let me answer you now, the way you always answered me. I'm proud of you. I have always been proud of you. I sat there on my own porch, his glasses in my hand, and I finally let the tears come, the ones I'd held back since a nurse asked me who there was to call. He had answered finally. He was proud. I left the porch light on that night. Not for anyone who was coming, just because for the first time in 7 years, the house was mine, and the light was mine to leave on.